much for coming. I wanted to say it's a really good crowd. I think we all had a really nice summer. It looks like people are pretty refreshed. Some people probably didn't have as much vacation as they would have liked, but I know it was a great time for our family. Had a nice break, and I hope you did too. I wanted to just say that we are excited because we did get a small grant from the AIER to put on some speakers, so we might be able to afford Professor Munger or Professor Salzman here. I don't know. They're pretty expensive.
Please let us talk.
And we are really pleased to welcome Phillip Magness. He is, I guess you could say he's a professor. He's certainly a professor at George Mason University for a while, and he's now a researcher with American Institute of Economic Research, which is, of course, their parent organization. And we're really pleased that he has taken the time to come down from DC. He's addressing a controversial topic, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for taking on just basically the powers that be. I guess there's a narrative out there, and he's saying, hey, let's ask some questions. So, as you know, our namesake is Frederick Bastiat. He wrote the law, and in the law, Bastiat said, "It is easy to understand why the law is used by the legislator to destroy in varying degrees among the rest of the people their personal independence by slavery, their liberty by oppression, and their property by plunder. This is done for the benefit of the person who makes the law and in proportion to the power that he holds." What that means is that if slavery exists, it is the state that creates and perpetuates it. Capitalism levels power by giving everyone access to the chance to invest and become wealthy. Slavery, controlled by the state, restricts power permanently to a select few. In fact, it was capitalism that ultimately threatened slavery with extinction because free labor is so much more productive. Professor Magness?
All right. Thank you, everyone, for having me out to this event. Really looking forward to what will hopefully be a pretty productive conversation. I will say, as I start, if you have any questions during the talk, if you want me to go over anything that's on some of the slides, feel free to interrupt. We can have that type of a conversation. I'll try to save some time for the end as well. But I want to take you back to a story that begins around August of 2019. And there was just a random morning in August. I woke up, and as I normally do, I was reading the newspapers while eating breakfast. And I noticed this thing in the New York Times called the 1619 Project. Now, some backdrop on this 1619 Project is I had been a follower of the New York Times' historical series for quite some time. Even going back to the early 2010s, some of you may remember another project they did called the Disunion series. And it was to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War. And what they did from basically 2011 through 2015, coinciding with the 150th anniversary, 1861 to 1865, they ran almost daily features exploring the controversies, the historical literature and scholarship, the popular angles, the way that the Civil War is viewed in memory, and of course, front and center of that is the question of slavery. It was a very well done series. I say that in part because I contributed a couple pieces to it, but I was one of several hundred people that wrote for it over that basically 4.5 year span that it ran. And there were controversies in it, there were disagreements, there were debates between scholars, but the product, I think, advanced the study of Civil War history in the public's mind. And it advanced an understanding of slavery as a central feature of Civil War history, something we cannot avoid, in fact, should tackle head on and look at its complexities and how it shaped the nation up to and during that particular conflict. So I saw the 1619 Project on that morning in August of 2019, and my initial reaction was excitement. It was the New York Times is doing another series. It's historically themed. It's on an area where I've written and done quite a bit of scholarship and work, but it's also an area that I think is important to our national conversation. I thought, maybe this is something that will play out over the next several weeks or months in ways that yield another look at productive scholarly exchange in that area. Then I started to read it. And I read the first essay, and my reaction to it wasn't immediately hostile. It was more so, some of these claims are a little bit off. I want to see where they're going with this. Then I flipped to the second major essay, which was by Matthew Desmond, a sociologist, and it was on the relationship between slavery and free market capitalism, the economics of slavery. And about 2 paragraphs in, I was, oh my God, this is a train wreck. I'm in the middle of reading that essay, and I get a message pops up on my computer screen. And it was Steve Horwitz, an economist, some of you know. And he said, I hope you're reading this, someone needs to take it down. I thought, I'm reading it, and it is as bad as I think you are seeing as well. So by the end of that evening, the first issue had come out of the 1619 Project. In August 2019, I got an email in my inbox, and it was from one of the editors at National Review, and he said, hey, can you write a rebuttal to this thing? And I may have been the first critic out the gate to even write anything on the 1619 Project. And I thought that was going to be the end of it. You know, it engaged them, made a response, called attention to some of the major errors and problems in it, and maybe this will go on for a little bit longer, but this will be old news soon enough. I had no idea that 3 years later, or now just over 3 years later, we'd still be debating it, and not only that, it had risen to the very top of the curricular debates in our K through 12 and college education system. Even to the point that just 2 weeks ago, the president of the American Historical Association had to issue a very prominent public apology because he wrote a column in their monthly newsletter that mildly criticized the 1619 Project for being overly presentist and obsessed with modern day politics at the expense of historical accuracy. Which I think is a fair summary and indictment. Well, he walked that back because he was pounced upon by the mobs, the activist mobs of the history profession, and issued an apology for all the people he had harmed by saying such critical things about the 1619 Project and other areas of the history profession. Unfortunately, that's the intellectual state that we live in right now, especially in the academy and in the academic discipline of history. And yet, I think it's something that is very much wedded to the current frenzies of the moment. It's something that I think the future will look back upon and wonder what infected academic history for this brief moment in the late 2010s, early 2020s that caused it to basically go off the rails. And that's my assessment of where things stand about 3 years later. Now, digging into the 1619 Project, though, I want to go back to that August in 2019 when I raised very particular objections to one specific essay in the 1619 Project, had unease about another. That was the introductory essay by Nicole Hannah-Jones, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the rest of the project itself did not strike me as terribly objectionable. There were several other essays. Some of them were provocative and controversial in some of their claims. Others were just standard summaries of historical scholarship, literary works, legal analysis. There's even poetry and photography in it that, in my general opinion, met the caliber of what you'd expect from a paper of record like the New York Times. And yet, we never hear about those. In the last 3 years, how many of you could name a single author other than Nicole Hannah-Jones and maybe Matthew Desmond who wrote for the 1619 Project? Anyone? You can't. Why? Those two have so thoroughly overshadowed the entire remainder of the series that we don't even consider or talk about the other works in it. And even when they assign them in classrooms, it's those two essays that always get assigned. Now there's a postscript, a third one that Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote, and it's basically a political case for slave reparations. But that's about it that gets assigned in the classrooms. Most of the curriculum is built around that. You can find bits and pieces of some of the other stuff mentioned, but it is almost never discussed. New York Times did put it out as a full magazine issue. It's about 60, 70 pages, give or take. They've expanded it into a book-length treatment. The interesting thing about the book is it's actually substantially worse than the original. And this is an oddity for journalistic and scholarly development, and something that is controversial, and I think is universally accepted now, that the 1619 Project in its original form did require some corrections to errors. In fact, they were very light on the corrections they made, but nonetheless they somehow managed to make it significantly worse. We can get into that, but I want to start with the original and take it at face value. And I'm going to focus on, in this talk, the two major areas of contention, those two essays I mentioned. I'm also going to point out one area where I think the 1619 Project did get it right. And in fact, we've got a lot of unfair criticism from the political right, even on it. Although some of that's even changed, thanks to the revisions. As I said, the revisions made it worse in the book. We'll get to why. But the two major areas of contention go back to the original controversy that burst onto the public scene in those weeks that followed its initial publication, and really carried on through about December or January of 2020. So January 2020 was kind of the peak of the first wave of the controversy. And if you remember, there was a well-circulated, generally well-regarded public letter by 5 historians that was published in the New York Times as a response, a criticism of the 1619 Project. And the editor was pretty dismissive of that. I mention it because those 5 historians are all of the center left. Sean Willentz, James McPherson, Victoria Bynum, Jim Oakes, and Gordon Wood. I think were the 5 authors of that. Not generally writers that we consider associated with the political right. Certainly not writers that are defenders of libertarianism or free market capitalism. These are people that, like in Willentz's case, he works directly with the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and most recently he's been advising the Biden administration on its inflation policy and how to frame that somehow. He popped up at the White House a few weeks ago. I'm not sure what to read into that, but that's the gist of the critics. Those critics came together. They also drew a lot of popular attention, not only through that open public letter they wrote to the New York Times, but they all published longer form essays and interviews with something called the World Socialist Website, which is the Trotskyist wing of the something or another Socialist Party of America. It's People's Judean Front versus People's Front of Judea, with all these little communist groups and stuff. But they're one of those wings, very, very far to the left. And strangely, for probably the first time in my entire career, I found myself on the same side as the Trotskyists, fighting the New York Times, where I'm coming at it from kind of a free market classical liberal perspective. And then at the same time, you have people like Newt Gingrich is going on Fox News and throwing bombs at it in a very different way, a different style of historical analysis. So that was kind of the landscape. And then Trump got involved a few months later, of course, as he's prone to do, started tweeting about it, and created an entire commission to critique it. Had some hits and some misses on that. But the core of the original controversy revolved around these first 2 issues. The role of slavery in the American Revolution, and that comes from Nicole Hannah-Jones' lead essay. And that's gotten probably 75% of the attention, all focusing on that essay and its derivatives. Most of the remainder went to what I mentioned, the Matthew Desmond essay on slavery and capitalism. These essays appear in sequential order as major features of the 1619 Project, and that is for a reason. And it's something that came clearer into view over the past 3 years to see exactly what Nicole Hannah-Jones was up to, what she was going for with the 1619 Project. But the gist of it is, these 2 essays frame the crucial period in history between 1776 and 1865, when slavery is ascendant and reaches its peak in the United States. It's interesting because neither of the writers, Nicole Hannah-Jones and Matthew Desmond, are scholars of this era. Desmond is a sociologist who focuses on race relations in the late 20th century. And I've searched without success to see if he had ever written on this subject before the 1619 Project. The answer is no. Nicole Hannah-Jones is a journalist, an opinion journalist. She's perfectly fine to write on historical topics, but they framed it as history and journalism mixed together, and you find that they pivot between the two. I've called it Schrodinger's 1619 Project. It's history when it wants to be history, but it's simultaneously not history. It's journalism when that's convenient. And yet the basic narrative that they're putting together is that the American Revolution is founded on the defense of slavery, occurs in the defense of slavery, and that defense of slavery is connected to economic reasons that run through our history. And in Desmond's telling, which Nicole Hannah-Jones fully endorses and embraces, slavery is basically the engine that creates American capitalism, allows industrialization to occur in the United States, props us up to, by the end of the 19th, early 20th century, where the United States is one of the leading economic powers in the world. And therefore, here comes the modern day political angle. We need redistribution of that ill-gotten wealth, those ill-gotten gains. We need slavery reparations and a whole host of other programs connected to it. So it's very presentist, it's very political. The other essays, although they do focus on some very interesting themes, and I say even rightly on some of the criminal justice reform angles, have all been neglected or shoved to the back behind the controversy around the two. And I think that's really one of the great tragedies of the 1619 Project, is everything else associated with it has been overshadowed and now saddled with the legacy of what's happened in these first two essays. I want to walk through some of the history of it. And first, ask you the question: did the colonists rebel to protect slavery? No. There is actually no major historical work of literature or anything in scholarship that would actively assert that claim as it is framed. And in fact, it is something that became the earliest point of contention in the 1619 Project. I know that's a little bit small there, but there's just a picture I took, a photograph of the print edition. And that's Nicole Hannah-Jones. She says that the colonists decided to declare their independence from Britain. The main reason was because they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. That's underlined in red there. This is the one that the New York Times issued a minor correction to. They said, instead of the colonists, they changed it to some of the colonists. And then she said, oh, well, we fixed it. This is scholarship now. But notice the next line. She continues. By 1776, Britain had grown deeply conflicted over its role in the barbaric institution that had reshaped the Western Hemisphere. In London, there were growing calls to abolish the slave trade. This would have upended the economy of the colonies in both the North and the South. This is the connection to the Matthew Desmond essay. It's also probably even more ridiculous than the first claim. Did Britain abolish slavery in 1776 or any time thereabouts? No, in fact, it was a 50-year slog of a fight that almost upended the entire empire before they got to the final point of abolishing slavery. Talk a little bit about that fight in a moment.
Might have done like half a dozen Quakers in mine.
Yeah, half a dozen Quakers and the clear minority of Parliament. They have half a dozen members of Parliament as well that are saying, yes, we should get rid of slavery. And everyone's like, what? You're crazy. But the notion that the colonies revolted over slavery and the notion that the British Empire was about to move against slavery are rooted in nonsense. And yet she built these arguments around kernels of historical truth, including one piece of evidence out of the British Empire that she makes a big deal of, even though she probably doesn't understand the full implications of the case. This is a case that happened in London in 1772. There was a merchant by the name of Stewart from Virginia, sailed across the Atlantic, pulled into the docks at London, and he brought his personal slave with him. Slave was by the name of Somerset. He's holding a slave on the ship in the docks in London, and a small group of those Quaker abolitionists get wind of the fact that he has a slave on his ship. And what do? They walk down to the courts, and they file a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of the slave. They said, This man, this merchant, is holding another human being prisoner on a ship, and he doesn't have the right to do that under law. The judge, Lord Mansfield, who's kind of an equivalent of like a Supreme Court justice in the UK system at the time, he's a major prominent jurist. He's a liberal-minded in the old classical sense. Ran in some of the same circles that Adam Smith did. Was a major contributor to the standardization of British international trade law around the principle of free trade with some of his work. But he hears this case, and he hears the arguments, and he looks in the statute books and says, by God, they're right. There's no law in England proper that allows a person to hold another person as a slave. It had never been passed by Parliament. And he writes up the case, and the famous passage, the money quote from the case, is right there on the screen. It says, the slavery is of such a nature, it's incapable of being introduced by courts of justice upon mere reasoning. It has to take its origin from positive law. It has to be passed by a statute book. They have those statutes over in the colonies. They don't have them in London proper, though. Mr. Somerset, you're free to go. It's quite an important and interesting case. It only frees one slave, but it sets a precedent, and it established this principle as a major part of the English legal system that is actually inherited in the United States. How many of you have heard of the Dred Scott case? Much more famous. Has anyone read the legal briefs of the Dred Scott case? They are built around the same argument. Dred Scott was a slave that had been taken into the North in states where slavery was not permitted under law. Therefore, they tried to get him freed. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is 1856, 1857 when this is playing out. They got it all the way to the Supreme Court to hear a case on Somerset-style arguments tracing back to this precedent. So you have the next more than half a century of jurisprudence is directly derived from this moment in jurisprudence in the United States. 1619 Project would not let you know that. They want it pushed aside because Dred Scott's lawyers unfortunately lost that case. On the eve of the Civil War, they were ready to retry it with another case out of New York, Lemon versus New York. They said, well, we lost in the Supreme Court the last time around. We're going to go at it at another angle. Let's raise another Somerset case. But we have this great ruling, and Nicole Hannah-Jones's argument is that this demonstrates abolitionism was rising and possibly imminent in the British Empire, and it was supposed to be imposed on the colonies. This case does make waves, causes controversy across the British Empire, but not so much in the United States. It's mostly the Caribbean. We do know some of the reactions that come from the United States that are not mentioned at all in the 1619 Project, including one that comes in a letter from a very insignificant figure by the name of Benjamin Franklin. He catches word of the case and reads it, and he writes to one of his friends, abolitionist Anthony Benezet. He says, I had denounced the hypocrisy of this country, referring to the British Empire, which encourages such a detestable commerce for promoting the slave trade. While it piqued itself on its virtue, its love of liberty, and the equity of its courts, it set free a single Negro. Franklin's response is, the problem with Somerset is it does not go far enough. It did not free them all. You would not know that from reading the 1619 Project. And in fact, this continues to be referred to. One that I consider particularly notable, it comes out of a document that is passed in Virginia. It's called the Fairfax Resolves. It is a county-level declaration of protest against the Crown as the revolutionary spirit is raising. Most of it's coming out of the Northeast, out of Boston. All the tax protests out of Boston, led by James Otis, another abolitionist. But in 1774, a group of Virginians gets together at the courthouse in Fairfax, Virginia, and they declare among their protests against the Crown that it has sustained a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade in human beings. Significant because the author of this, co-author, is George Washington, resident of Fairfax County, and a slave owner. We have to admit that. So what we see is in this discussion of the evidence, the 1619 Project really sets off on a bad note of making historical claims that are completely at odds with a very complicated record. Note, I'm not denying that slavery is an issue in 1776. In fact, it's an issue that cross-cuts the entire American Revolution and the founding generation that follows it. Right here, I tried to put together a list of at least the major abolitionists to slave owners within the founding generation, including the diversity of opinions that you see on that. We had outright abolitionists and proto-abolitionists. Ben Franklin was one of them. James Otis, as I mentioned, is another. People that write openly we should end slavery. There were anti-slavery men that did not own slaves, but did not view it as the time at the moment to strike against the institution, although they considered it an emerging problem that would need to be acted upon. John Adams, probably the most famous in that group. My favorite person on this list, the anti-slavery slave owner. There's a complication. There are quite a few of them, actually, that spread across the South, but I want to point out one. Luther Martin. Not Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, Luther Martin. He is the Attorney General of the colony of Maryland, a delegate at the Constitutional Convention. He's also Aaron Burr's defense attorney in the great battle over whatever the Burr plot happened to be. Martin is one of the anti-federalist delegates at the Constitutional Convention, and his major objection, even though he had been a slave owner from a southern state, a small slave owner, only had like one or two, not a big plantation, he recognized the immorality of the institution and furthermore recognized that it was at odds with the principles of liberty that were set forth in the Declaration, and he stands up in the Constitutional Convention, probably drunk. We know this because there's lots of recorded instances of Mr. Martin having a bottle of whiskey with him as he gave very long-winded speeches at the Constitutional Convention. There's other records. This is one of the fun things about him. Because he was a notorious alcoholic, sometimes the legislature or courts would impose rules and says you cannot come with your bottle. So he figured out another trick. The night before, he'd soak a loaf of bread in a bowl of whiskey and sit there and nibble on it the entire time. It's a really interesting guy. But he stands up at the Constitutional Convention and gives a tirade of a speech that says, if we adopt this Constitution as it is written, the fact that it does not ban slavery, it countenances and anticipates its continuation, at least for some time to come, does not give us an end to this institution, a way out, means that we are betraying the spirit of the entire revolution that we just fought and won, and we're sending the very wrong signal to the world. So he goes back to Maryland and says, don't ratify this document. It doesn't do enough to split slavery on the end to extinction. So that's his argument. There are also slave-owning manumitionists. Robert Counselor Carter, we're getting into a little bit more obscure territory. He's a major political figure in colonial Virginia, one of the richest men in the state, owns one of the largest plantations in the state. He has a religious awakening, religious conversion one day right after the Revolution, so certainly philosophically engaged in that. And he walks down to the courthouse and he files a deed of rent at the court freeing all the slaves, 1,000 people overnight, just out of a religious conversion. His neighbors are furious. They basically chase him out of the state. But it's probably the single largest act of abolition prior to the Civil War in one fell stroke. We had slave owners that were conflicted and never could quite figure a way to get out of the institution. Thomas Jefferson, we all know about that one. Slave owners with certain qualms about slavery that are fighting to figure a political solution, but are openly admitting in their private letters to their friends that we don't know how to get off of this beast that we've inherited. We don't know how to wean ourselves from the system. And they try a variety of approaches, including colonizing the slaves abroad. This is how we ended up founding Liberia. It's the most famous story there. But then you finally get to the bottom of the list, the pro-slavery slave owners involved in the American founding. I'll name two of them. John Rutledge. Who's heard of John Rutledge? A few of you? He's the bad guy. If you've ever seen the musical 1776 that sings the slavery song. William Lawton Smith. Anyone ever heard of him? Another South Carolinian. He's probably the most obscure person on this list. He is the leading defender of slavery in the early republic. 1619 project would have us believe that the majority of the founding occurs in that very last category down there. Doesn't want to talk about any of the different layers above it. Nicole Hannah-Jones enlists to her evidence another event on top of the Somerset case called the Dunmore Proclamation of 1775. It occurs in November 1775. And what it is the colonial governor of Virginia, who at that time, the war has already happened. They haven't declared independence, but the war has been underway in full for at least 6 months. You go all the way back to Lexington and Concord. That has occurred in the spring. The Battle of Bunker Hill occurs over the summer. Armies are in the fields, and the governor of Virginia has taken refuge on a ship sitting in the James River. He's been driven out of the capital, and he's still pretending to govern the colony. And in a final moment of desperation, he issues a proclamation across Virginia and says, if you join my militia, I will pardon you, and to any slaves of plantations that are in rebellion who join my militia and fight, they will be granted their freedom. It's a pretty bold move. Had another clause that said, slaves of loyal plantation owners, you don't get to qualify for this. So sorry, you're out of luck. Over the course of the American Revolution, it's estimated that maybe 1,000 to 2,000 enslaved people flee their plantations and join Dunmore's cause. There were other incidents of slaves that are evacuated with the British cause out of New York City in 1783 that go to Nova Scotia. But it's something that cuts across both lines of the Revolution. Dunmore, who's pictured there, he was a nobleman from Scotland who joined the British Foreign Office and traveled around as governor of colonies all over the place. He's not a very good guy when it comes to his history on slavery. In fact, what was he aiming to do to reestablish himself as the crown governor of Virginia and reallocate the plantations that had been seized in the rebellion to all of his friends, including the property that was tied to those plantations, thousands upon thousands of slaves. After he gets chased out of Virginia, they reassign him to the Bahamas, takes up residence in Nassau. What do you think he does? Requisitions the slave population of Nassau and puts them to work building fortifications around the island, monuments and castles to himself. Really nasty character. And in fact, he adopts some laws that are supposed to protect the well-being of the slaves, and they've done some studies of it, and they found really what he was trying to do is use the government to claim slave property from people he didn't like and give them to his friends. This is the great hero of the 1619 Project, apparently, from an abolitionist perspective. But Nicole Hannah-Jones has tried to reinterpret the Dunmore Proclamation as the driving impetus of why the American colonies declared their independence. As a whole, colonies as a whole. Not some of the colonies, this was the original version, all of the colonies. And in fact, she has a quote in her article where she says, for men like George Washington, the Dunmore Proclamation ignited their turn to independence. Converted them from just protesters to revolutionaries. A little problem with that. Dunmore Proclamation was signed November 7th, 1775. Washington had taken command of the Continental Army almost 6 months earlier. So apparently he had a time machine. He knew this was coming. And that's the gist of the 1619 Project's argument that slavery is entwined in the Revolution. And as you see, it's a very simplified version of a very complex issue that cross-cuts the entire revolutionary cause, and that there are no overt pro-slavery or anti-slavery interpretations of either side of that, but there are pro-slavery and anti-slavery men on both sides of the conflict. When the New York Times made these claims, they sent it out to a fact checker, an actual PhD historian, Leslie Harris at Northwestern University, and said, hey, can you just read our article before we go to print? She revealed this after it came out, but she revealed that she had written right back to the New York Times and said, I've read your piece, do not go to print with these claims about the American Revolution. They're wrong, you're going to get pilloried for them. They ignored her. It gets even more complicated when you start to see that slave owners in the British Empire are entwined with the cause of suppressing the revolution. There's a famous painting here. It hangs in the National Gallery over in London. And this thing's massive. It's like as tall as the ceiling. That is Sir Bannister Tarleton. Any of you seen that old kind of campy Mel Gibson movie about the Revolution? The bad guy's based on him. He was Cornwallis's cavalry commander. He fought in the Revolution because he was seeking to acquire land in the Carolinas. Land to start his own plantation. Why? His father owned the largest merchant company in Liverpool that was directly engaged in the slave trade. After the war, he goes back, gets elected member of Parliament, and for the next decade or so, he is the main pro-slavery voice in Parliament. In fact, defeats all of the early abolitionist efforts to even rein in or regulate the institution because it was cutting into the family business. So there's some of the complications. This portly fellow here, Charles James Fox. We like him. 2 reasons. One, he's the first member of Parliament to take notice of a book called The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. He read it at the Parliamentary Record and caused it to become an overnight bestseller and brought the 1783 edition of it to the world's view. But if you also notice something else about him, he's wearing a blue overcoat and a gold vest, a very large gold vest in this painting. His colors ring a bell. He intentionally sat for that painting as a member of Parliament in the middle of the American Revolution and said, I'm going to wear the colors of George Washington's uniform as a sign of protest against the crown. He had several run-ins with King George, was viewed as probably the foremost enemy of the crown in Parliament. One of those happened to be he was best friends with George's son, the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, who Charles James Fox, introduced George IV to what became his mistress, and who was seen as corrupting the crown in that regard. But he also is the author of the first legislative attempt to restrain slavery in the British Empire. Puts it up in 1791, a bill to restrict the slave trade. It goes down in flames, loses like several hundred votes to about 20 or something like that. Bannister Tarleton is the guy that leads the opposition that defeats him. Fox, in 1791, after he proposes his bill, devotes basically the remainder of his life, the next 18, 19 years or so in Parliament, to a single cause. That is striking down slavery. It's a 16-year slog to even get the slave trade itself restricted. He succeeds basically on his deathbed in 1807, passes the torch to William Wilberforce, who spends another 20-odd years crusading against slavery, till finally, after a slave revolt in Jamaica in 1831, induces the British Empire, some 50 years after Nicole Hannah-Jones says it was on the verge of abolition, to strike down slavery in the entire empire. A different course of events occurs in the colonies, including during the Revolution itself. There was this little plot of land that no one really knew who it belonged to. It's claimed by New Hampshire, some of what is now Canada, and New York. It was kind of a no man's land. No one lived there at the time. Still no one lives there. Called Vermont. And they declared independence in 1777 and cast their lot with the other 13 rebellious colonies. They wrote into their constitution explicitly capturing the spirit of the Declaration of Independence, saying that all men are created equal, and this also means enslaved people are created equal. Slavery is banned forever in the new independent Republic of Vermont. Enters eventually as the 14th state. There's some complex political history behind that. But it sets things into motion directly on the philosophical spirit of what happened in 1776 that are very much at odds with the depiction seen in the 1619 Project. As we see, as the revolution progresses, even before the final treaties are signed, before the British surrender at Yorktown, the other colonies, now independent states, are taking measures step by step by step to abolish slavery. It does start in the North. It starts in the areas where slavery is existent, but not as permanent as part of the economy. But 1780, Pennsylvania legislatively adopts something to put slavery on the road to demise. Ben Franklin's involved in that again. Massachusetts, they copy the Somerset case. They do it by a lawsuit and discover they had no recognition of slavery in the books, therefore all slaves in Massachusetts are free. And the interesting one about that, the Chief Justice who rules in that case explicitly invokes the Declaration of Independence and says, consistent with our principles and everything we're fighting this war against the crown on, we must free our slaves. It's the gist of his statement. New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island all follow in 1787 based on a measure first proposed by Thomas Jefferson in 1784. All of the Northwest Territories, now the modern-day Midwest, is declared admitted into the United States with a future that does not involve slavery. By Jefferson's design. New York's a straggler in 1799. New Jersey's a little bit further beyond that. And then the southern states, they start running into opposition for various reasons that it's entrenched. But it's important to consider. There are a few of the quotes from some of the writers at that time, including William Cushing, who was the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, where he says, every subject is entitled to liberty and so shall have it guarded by laws as well as life and property. And it's totally repugnant to the idea of being born slaves. That being the case, the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct in the new state constitution, which becomes one of the major bases of the federal constitution just 6 years later. There's Luther Martin at the Constitutional Convention. Slavery is inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character. Both of these figures were quoted extensively by the abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, who surprisingly does not make any appearance in the original version of the 1619 project connected with this topic. I think he's mentioned once in passing in one of the sections on literature. So what Nicole Hannah-Jones has done in pressing her claim and doubling down on her claim is excised the entire abolitionist history of the United States, including its philosophical origins and its actual successes, some of which predated the elimination of slavery in the British Empire. By implication, if you want to go into counterfactual history here, pose the question to you. Would slavery have persisted longer or shorter in the British Empire had the colonies not revolted? I would say almost certainly longer, the reason being that the interest groups of the Caribbean that held on to slavery for another 50 years would have been emboldened by further interest groups coming from the southern United States, which puts financial and other political pressures on Parliament to impede that goal. But this is the initial response to the 1619 project and its critique of slavery and the Revolution is that it's really not based in any fact. It's really not based in any conscientious interpretation of the evidence. It's selective, it's cherry-picked evidence that's badly misinterpreted. And Nicole Hannah-Jones gets taken to task for that. She basically brushes it off and ignores it after that one minor change that they made in response to the 5 historians' letters. But that was the first phase of the debate. Let's move on to the second question, the Matthew Desmond essay. Is slavery responsible for or wedded to American capitalism? No. But Nicole Hannah-Jones is going to say yes. And in fact, she's seized onto this claim, perhaps more than any other political claim that's made in the document, that capitalism is tainted, therefore we need massive redistribution. She's all into the Thomas Piketty literature about inequality rising. She's all into we need socialized health care and a wealth tax and massive public interventions into the economy. But her argument is fundamentally historical. She says that the reasons for this are to correct inequities that come from slavery and do so in a way that redistributes ill-gotten gains of slavery, accumulated wealth over the past 2.5 centuries. That's the gist of her argument. And she says, furthermore, this is an argument that's never received a proper hearing in the history of the American economy. It's been brushed aside and buried. The guilt of capitalism has been buried. And it's only black voices that have brought it to attention. And to prove that, she relies on these guys. That is Matthew Desmond, the author at the top. The others, that's Ed Baptist at Cornell University, Sven Beckert at Harvard University, Seth Rockman at Brown. There's a whole list of scholars. And they come from a school of thought called the New History of Capitalism School. It's really trendy right now in the history profession. And these are all people that basically have more or less the same thesis. That thesis is that cotton was the single engine driver of American industrialization, and because cotton is derived from slavery, all of the American economy is tainted by it. What does this mean in terms of the 1619 Project's interpretation? Well, this guy at the top, Matthew Desmond, he's at Princeton. Again, I want to point this out because these are all elite institutions that supposedly never had a voice before the 1619 Project came along. He consults these 6 other guys and they come up with an essay. He does a summary of their thesis that's basically an indictment of the entire American capitalist economic system. Rooted on the idea that cotton was such a significant engine of American industrialization and economic wealth and economic well-being and growth, that anything and everything is tainted by it, is touched by it, and therefore, through implication and guilt, redistribution must ensue. Some more complexities to it we'll get into, but I want to start off by noting that right in the opening of this essay, you find out Desmond is not just a bad scholar of the subject, he's actually, I would dare say, incompetent. I'll show this to you. This is the first thing I noticed on that morning I read this essay. There's Desmond in the New York Times in his column. He says, when accountants depreciate assets to save on taxes, or when a mid-level manager spends the afternoon filling in rows and columns on an Excel spreadsheet, they are repeating business procedures whose roots twist back to slave labor camps. If you use Microsoft Excel, you're using slavery. That was his actual argument. And he goes on with this theme for quite a bit. If you read the rest of the essay, he keeps saying he won't use accounting books to refer to plantation records. He says spreadsheets. A little anachronistic, but he said spreadsheets existed. And it's all based on this Microsoft Excel claim. He quotes it a little bit later. He attributes it to the historian Caitlin Rosenthal, who wrote a book about 5 or 6 years ago about the accounting practices used on the plantations. It's actually a reasonable scholarly work. I had read this book before, so I went and pulled my copy of it. And there's the excerpt on page, this is even the intro, it's not even the first chapter. I'll quote Rosenthal. She says, in the end, the direct ties between the plantations and today's practices are murky. This is not an origin story. I did not find a simple path where slaveholders' paper spreadsheets evolved into Microsoft Excel. Matthew Desmond misread Caitlin Rosenthal, transposed the claim, and built an entire argument around it. And the New York Times published it. I wrote the editor of the New York Times Magazine and pointed this out and said, here's a screenshot of this picture from the book he's citing. It's wrong. You need to fix this. And he responds a couple days later and says, well, that's just a difference of interpretation on what those words mean. But in the book project, they quietly deleted it. So this gets really interesting of where he's going. The broader claim, though, is that something known as capitalism emerged in the United States between 1776 and 1865, was responsible for massive growth and amounts of wealth, and capitalism itself is an amoral philosophical concept that permits human exploitation to occur that must be rectified. And that's the gist of his essays, and if you use Microsoft Excel, you're basically proving that, according to his claim. There's other similar types of things that he asserts in here. We can get some of the stats in a moment. I want to contrast that, though, Matthew Desmond's claim, his portrayal of his supposed trajectory of free market capitalism, with what Adam Smith had to say about slavery. And this was 1763, so before The Wealth of Nations, in one of his essays, lectures. It says, the persons that make laws in any country are persons that have slaves themselves. They will never make any laws mitigating their usage. Whatever laws are made with regard to slaves are intended to strengthen the authority of the masters and reduce the slaves to more absolute subjection. Turns out Adam Smith was an abolitionist. He writes quite a bit about this institution on a moral basis, on an economic basis. He says it's actually an inefficient way of producing things, all else equal. Now there are some modifications to that, one of which is if the slave owners can get themselves subsidized, they can actually outcompete free labor. But it requires the subsidy of the state to do so. And he makes a comprehensive case against slavery. So we have automatically an intellectual oddity. The founding father, if you want to say, of capitalism as a concept, as an idea, is an abolitionist, and yet capitalism is supposedly wedded at the hip to slavery. Something's not adding up here. It's even more complicated when you start to see what people wrote in the 19th century about the institution of slavery. Where did the attacks come from? I'll introduce you to a man named Thomas Carlyle. There. Saw the famous painting of Whistler's Mother and said, he did the Titanic thing, Rose in Titanic. I want you to paint me as you did one of your French girls or something. And assume the same pose. The Scottish philosopher, historian, probably one of the leading reactionary theorists, although he called himself a socialist at various points of the mid-19th century. And he had a really interesting take on economics. In 1849, he pens a horrific denunciation of what he dubs the dismal science. Why is economics dismal? Because it finds the secrets of the universe and the laws of supply and demand and reduces human governors to that of letting men alone. Who does he mean that economics is saying to let alone? Well, the slaves. Carlyle thinks slaves need order in their lives that are provided by the master. And he goes even further. He says, Exeter Hall Philanthropy, this is the Anti-Slavery Society's meeting hall in London, in the dismal science led by the sacred cause of black emancipation, to fall in love and make a wedding of it. You can see the rest from there. It says that all problems in the world trace to this institution of abolition. He was referring to something very specific. There was a political alliance between what we consider the early theorists of free market capitalism, from Adam Smith all the way through the Civil War, and abolitionism. So not only do we have a contradiction with Desmond's claim, we also have an intellectual oddity here that continues beyond Smith, which brings us over to the United States. George Fitzhugh, leading pro-slavery theorist of the South on the eve of the Civil War. Very odd character, but he wrote pamphlets and books that basically debated the abolitionists. He even went to the North a couple times and stood on the stage opposite of abolitionists, and they fought over whether slavery was a good or a bad thing. I want to read you the opening paragraph of the very first chapter of his 1854 book, Sociology for the South, or the Failure of a Free Society. Subtitle is important there. Political economy is the science of a free society. Its theory, its history alike establish this position. Its fundamental maxims, laissez-faire, are at war with all kinds of slavery for the fact they in fact assert individuals and people prosper most when governed least. He continues further in this book, our only quarrel with socialism is that it will not honestly admit that it owes its recent revival to the failure of universal liberty and is seeking to bring about some form of slavery and other means elsewhere in the world. Leading pro-slavery theorist on the eve of the Civil War hates the concept of free markets. Elsewhere in the book, he says the writings of Adam Smith and Jean-Baptiste Say and Frederick Bastiat should be tossed into the fire because they are the undoing of the slave system. So we've gone from this on the eve of the Civil War, where there's a clear dividing line. The pro-capitalist people are all anti-slavery, and the anti-capitalist people, including self-described socialists, are pro-slavery. Here we are 150 odd years later, and the claim is made that capitalism and slavery are wedded at the hip. So there's the intellectual inconsistency. What else does Matthew Desmond do? Well, he pulls out this horrendous little book called The Half Has Never Been Told by Ed Baptist, one of those 6 historians that I had the photos of earlier. And the gist of this book, Baptist reads some economic historians that found that the cotton economy in the United States grew by about 400% between 1800 and 1860 in volume and output and measured growth. And Baptist comes up with a thesis. He says, well, the only thing that could explain this growth in cotton must be that capitalists moved in and mechanized the plantations and basically acted as evil entrepreneurs and figured out ways to extract more toil, more labor out of slaves by beating them half to death. And this is true capitalism, in his thesis. He gets to some really odd territory on this. One of his claims that comes, probably the most famous claim of the book, is he does some fuzzy math and concludes that cotton production on the eve of the Civil War accounted for 50% of the entire U.S. economy. And multiple economic historians have looked at this, and they noticed right away he committed elementary accounting errors that in your undergrad macro 101 class, when you do the national income accounts section, are pointed out to you. He double and triple counts intermediate goods and stages of production until he gets to the point where his numerator is swelled and his denominator is held flat, and suddenly half the U.S. economy is made up of cotton and therefore slavery. Actual reality is about 5 to 6% of the U.S. economy on the eve of the Civil War. So this is a really interesting claim that Desmond leans in heavily on and says that this is basically the intellectual basis of his essay. And so far, the New York Times refuses to do anything to address this. Although I did raise it to him. I pointed this out directly to Nicole Hannah-Jones like a couple weeks after the essay appeared in print. And her main means of communicating back is there on Twitter. And this is her response to me. She says, well, economists dispute a few of Baptist's calculations, but not the book itself or its thesis. Therefore, I refuse to change or address anything. We aren't going to revisit this again. There are 3 book reviews of Ed Baptist's book from leading economists. Alan Olmsted said, Ed Baptist's study of capitalism and slavery is flawed beyond repair. Doesn't dispute the thesis. Eric Hill, the many specious arguments and failures of analytical reasoning in this book undermine its effectiveness as social criticism. Stanley Engerman, the general response, however, by Baptist is to charge those who disagree with him, even when it is over what some may regard as merely errors of historical fact and understanding, with racism. And I could print like a dozen more of these across all the journals that panned this book and said it's basically junk history. Of course, the historians that don't want to engage in economics gave it all sorts of book awards, and the 1619 Project has followed suit. What we see in the 1619 Project's treatment of economics is a fundamental attempt to popularize this new history of capitalism school built around those peculiar groups of scholars that all make a similar argument. And the oddity of this school, which really comes through in Desmond's essay, is that it unintentionally revisits an ancient economic argument, an argument that's so ancient that it was widely discussed and debated on the eve of the Civil War itself. That argument is the King Cotton thesis, which you probably heard about in high school history class. The notion that cotton was so essential to the U.S. economy, to paraphrase the words of Senator James Henry Hammond of South Carolina in 1857, that no nation on earth would dare make war upon it, for in doing so, they would collapse the world economy. Cotton was so central to production of everything that not even the North would consider making war upon the southern states. And they basically said that this is our free card, this is our trump card to win the conflict, to secede. And the entire Confederate foreign policy was built around that. They tried to withhold cotton as a carrot, offer it to the European powers. They tried in some places to actually counter the blockade using cotton running to draw Europe into the war, the Civil War, on their behalf. And what did Europe say? We're going to get our cotton from somewhere else. So King Cotton theory, which was originally put forth as a pro-Confederate economic argument, was debunked and practiced by the Civil War, has been unwittingly rehabilitated by the new historians of capitalism through faulty math and bad statistics, and is now pushed into the classrooms via the 1619 Project's incompetent distillation of it. Desmond goes even further, and this is where we see the real roots of it. Very few people have pointed to this, but I think it's important to note, is that his recycling of the King Cotton thesis doesn't come directly from the Confederacy, as one might assume, although there are clear similarities between the two of them. He actually draws it out of a strain of Marxian thought that was popular around the early 20th century, and he actually cites it to one of these examples, and some of the people that he works with, like Sven Beckert in particular, really cite this. Here's a quote from Desmond's essay, the extended version. It says, "What should have followed industrialization, as Karl Marx and a long list of other theorists have predicted, was a large-scale labor movement. Factory workers made to work to log hours under harsh conditions, as well as farm workers, should have locked arms and risen up against their bosses, gaining political power in the formation of an American Labor Party, or even ushering in a socialist revolution in the United States." Why did this not occur? Well, Desmond says, I know the answer. It's because Northern elites were forging an industrial proletariat factory worker society, while Southern elites were forming a agrarian proletariat society that divided the worker interests from uniting in their inevitable goal of socialist revolution, and therefore deflected socialism from taking root in the United States. This is a roundabout way of getting to the heart of what Desmond's really arguing. He's saying the problem with slavery is that it parsed up the workers as an interest group and prevented them from asserting their ascendance and ushering in socialism. It's not that slavery wronged people, although he'd probably agree that, yeah, slavery's bad. I'm not going to knock him on that. But he views the great problem with it is its disruption to socialism. This is a weird fringe theory to base a major historical work on. Where does it come from? An early Marxist theorist by the name of Werner Sombart wrote a book called Der moderne Kapitalismus in 1904, give or take. Never been translated into English, but they use some of the words and references to this. Well, one of Sombart's major theses was that socialism had not emerged in the United States because of the disruptions caused by the cotton economy and slavery. He says, the Negro question has removed any class character from the American economy, and as a result, there's no interest to emerge around putting pressure on the government for socialism. This is the crackpot fringe of crackpot fringes of Marxist theory, even to the point that Sombart, he's better known today, is about 30 years later, he converts himself from a socialist to a national socialist to get in the good graces of a certain political regime, so he's kind of discredited in that respect. But this is the root of this particular school of thought. So I beat up on the 1619 Project quite a bit. Mentioned a couple things that it did get right. We can wrap up on this because it's got kind of a postscript, a really interesting postscript. Well, the original version of the 1619 Project, which I think started on asking interesting questions, but veered off the rails really quickly because of the politicization and all the errors that I've mentioned, did nonetheless redirect some historical attention to a subject called colonization. The colonization movement, the settlement of Liberia and similar colonies as a post-slavery society for manumitted or freed slaves. And this had always been an oddity in the history profession because it mostly comes out of the North, but it's not quite abolitionist. It's a moderate anti-slavery movement that also involves physical relocation. There's a lot of oddities behind it. It's never really fit into American history. And the 1619 Project says we need to revisit and study colonization as one of the parts of the story, one of the complicated moral and political parts of the story that goes all the way up into the Civil War. And in fact, I know this is a small text, but it's again from the original Nicole Hannah-Jones essay, where she brings attention to, as late as the Lincoln administration, they're pushing colonization in the Civil War as a solution, paired with the Emancipation Proclamation to ending slavery. And part of this was to appease white supremacists in the North that didn't want a multiracial society. Another part of it is to alleviate the political conflict in the South that would emerge if you suddenly free half the population. All sorts of motives behind it. Nicole Hannah Jones, to her credit, drew attention to this as one of the areas of history that she wanted to highlight and reintroduce to our educational curriculum. And in fact, some early historian responses to the 1619 Project tried to continue an older historiography that dismisses attention on colonization. They attacked her, said, well, you're making a point about colonization that we don't agree with. And this came from some of the, including some of the 5 historians that wrote that letter to the New York Times. Well, they didn't put it in the letter in some of their interviews, they mentioned it. James McPherson, for example, said that she was basically going down a rabbit hole by trying to reinvestigate colonization and elevating its presence in the historical literature beyond what it merited or what it warranted. And Nicole Hannah Jones responds to that. She says, well, McPherson's dated scholarship on Lincoln and his efforts to colonize black people at emancipation, this is wrong because recent scholarship shows that Lincoln continued these efforts. Further, McPherson isn't even answering the question. Asked whether Lincoln believed black people were an obstacle to national unity, he goes off on a tangent, dismisses the colonization angle of the literature, and she says, oh, and by the way, there's been recent scholarship that shows McPherson is out of date. Note there's a link at the bottom there, Amazon. Let's click on that link. Yeah. She was explicitly citing a book that I happen to co-author on this very subject. And she tweeted out and referenced in interviews also a couple other links. Said, also, yeah, the New York Times has also written recently on this subject, quoting a few years ago, 2013. Yeah. Alex Tabarrok, an economist friend, pointed this out to her. Said, you realize that one of your critics in other parts of the 1619 Project authored all of that. She never mentioned my book again. But it is true. We do have clear evidence that as late as the Civil War, colonization is a major objective of the Lincoln administration, including the morning he signs the Emancipation Proclamation. He signs a colonization contract. 6 months later, signs another one that I found in the National Archives of Belize. Had never been noticed before. See A. Lincoln at the bottom there. That's June 13th, 1865. And went down to the site of the colony in Belize. The ruins are in the jungle. So this was very much a real part of history. And Nicole Hannah Jones originally called attention to it. Until Alex Tabarrok pointed out that I was the author, her opinions changed. And
Lincoln dead by June 13,
1865,
1865?
yeah, is when he dies, when he's assassinated.
Yeah, so because he died, April 15th.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
you couldn't have signed that in June.
No, it was June 1863 is when that order was, but there are other documents that go as late as like January 1865. So she goes on a tirade personally against me. These get even more fun. Further, Magness isn't even an expert on 1619 because where he said something was wrong, other more distinguished subject matter experts disagreed with him. Just a random person demands a correction because I tried to go through all the proper channels of getting this fixed before publicly criticizing it and got blown off. This happens now like on a weekly basis from her. There are literally hundreds of these. She just goes on a tirade every now and then because she's mad that I've critiqued something on the 1619 Project. And then finally, when the new book came out, guess which passage was deleted? The one referring to my book. And she replaced it with another passage cited to this guy that says the exact opposite. Just point that out. This is the level of scholarly engagement you get from this thing. Wasn't the only thing she changed. There's the other postscript. I discovered this almost completely by happenstance. It was around September 2020. She went on CNN defending the project, and she announces on CNN, they asked her, well, didn't you say that this project was intended to supplant 1776 as the origin date of America as a country and reorient it around slavery? And she looks at the camera and says, I never said that. And several, including other reporters, were kind of scratching their heads when this goes on national broadcast. They start quoting all the different times she said that. And then I'm reading it, and I think, I remember reading that exact line, and in fact, it was in the original 1619 project. So I go to their website. Very faintly underlined there, it says, understanding 1619 as our true founding. That's the original version. It was no longer there. Just quietly stealth deleted overnight. Do some probing and investigation and found the exact date of its deletion. It was right after the New York Times submitted the 1619 project for a Pulitzer Prize. And it had been one of the early controversial claims that they wanted to get rid of. They sanitized and scrubbed their website and never said a thing about it. And then she goes on TV and pretended it never existed. What do I seek to imply on this? Well, and then she also denied it after I wrote an article that basically broke that story. There were no stealth corrections to the 1619 project. What does this mean? Well, unfortunately, I think it gets us to the conclusion, the theme that I pointed out at the very beginning, which is that the 1619 project started on an admirable topic, botched some of the early handling of it, had a chance to correct and respond to critics, but went in the exact opposite direction, and has actually continuously and vociferously made it worse as it's progressed. What we have today now is a project that set out to reorient the American educational curriculum and understanding of its past around slavery, including in ways that called attention to overlooked aspects of it, but did so in a non-nuanced way, did so in a way that was more interested in its present-day political message than historical accuracy, and has only doubled, tripled, and quadrupled down on that ever since then. The unfortunate result is the great tragedy of the project. What we have today is a project overshadowed by its errors, overshadowed by its obstinance in sticking to those errors, and overshadowed by its continual political dependence and reliance and propping up of those errors out of a desire to achieve something in the present day at the expense of American history, our understanding of the past. And on that, I'll leave it and ask to any questions that you have. Yes, sir.
I'm curious if slavery was such a key point in the revolution. She mentioned that it was one of the key grievances listed in the Declaration?
She doesn't deal with that. Most of the 1619 Project authors just going to push it aside, which is a real misfortune. I mean, there is a quest to really turn Jefferson into a villain, and I'm not saying I'm going to propose like a sanitized version of Jefferson's history. He's a very complex and conflicted figure.
And the other thing I keep thinking about when you're talking about all this is, if slavery is so key to capitalism, why did the North become so much more prosperous than the South?
That's the counterfactual that we don't want to consider. And in fact, there's good empirical work that studies the evolution of the Southern economy both before and after slavery. And they find that the counties, even down at the county level where slavery is more intense, there's a bigger slave population, lag economically behind like the small farm counties up in the hills where there's not much of a touch of slavery. For decades after the Civil War.
You could argue it still hasn't caught up.
Exactly. And what this does is it revives really interest in an argument Adam Smith made that says all else equal, slavery is going to underperform free labor and other free economic instruments. He also says that slavery is basically an opportunity cost imposer. It's a retardant on economic development. It squeezes out other uses of capital investment. That prevents industrialization. It prevents diversification of an economy. Smith was even hinting at some points that the British colonies, talking about the Caribbean, that used slavery, basically any wealth that they sent back to England, first off, it squandered on large estates It's an absentee landlord that owns the plantation from afar, and he builds himself a giant house and doesn't really do anything with it. So it's like a malinvestment of resources argument. But the second thing is Smith is going to point out that the cost of propping up this system internationally basically eats away any economic gain it would have produced. Now there's a huge debates about where the exact calculations fall, but it's a deep part of history, and that's nowhere to be found in this argument. It's really just a sloppy back of the envelope style resuscitation of the King Cotton thesis that was debunked by the Civil War. Yes, sir.
But I don't want to take away from like the specific one of this, but I do have a like more philosophical question.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Hayden White's work at history?
Hayden White. I would have to look at the title to be more specific. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that he argued, and you kind of mentioned this in your presentation, some of the critics around the second essay using a lot of word games,
Yeah.
reaching definitions around the suture needs, and your response to the New York Times around, well, it's a matter of interpretation. I mean, this was classic Whitean theory around history that now has become this post-structuralist project in history, where now it's up to the writer, whatever he wants to say, and interpret history that way.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's become a pervasive thing in your profession?
In the academic portion of the discipline, absolutely. I seriously worry for the future of history as a discipline. And not just saying that from the scholarship's bad, which it is. There are exceptions out there. There are some excellent scholars, individual scholars that are doing great work, but there are fewer and fewer of them. The overwhelming thrust of the profession at the moment is arguing a political narrative relevant to today. And that was the big blow up at the AHA a couple of weeks ago.
This is really what sparked my interest.
Yeah,
I'm trying to
yeah.
go back to this kind of attitude where, we can all have free play with text, it's a matter of interpretation.
Matter of interpretation and subordination of facts that they don't want to hear. And that was one of the major arguments that was made against James Sweet, was the president of the AHA, who mildly criticizes the 1619 project, and all these attacks that come on him, the mob that happens to sit in academia, are like, you can't say these things because you're giving ammunition to the enemy to attack the 1619 project. How dare you say this at this moment in our history when the enemy is trying to discredit the 1619 project, and you're giving it the imprint and status of our profession as its leader. So they aren't concerned about the truth. They aren't concerned about careful, nuanced interpretation of evidence and fact. It's all about controlling the narrative.
Well, following up on that too, I mean, the publishers, I think, are at fault as well.
Mhm.
What happened to integrity with, I hate to use the word fact checkers, but, they're publishing the stuff that is obviously not true, as true.
They're publishing it as not true, and they're wantonly opposed to making corrections if those corrections are going to make their narrative look bad. And I say this from direct encounters with Jake Silverstein, who was the editor of this section of the New York Times. I probably had 6 or 7 direct email exchanges with him. I came out as a critic. I wrote that essay for National Review on both philosophical and empirical grounds, but it wasn't, this is trash that needs to be repudiated. It was, here's what the 1619 project gets wrong. Of the more substantive, and I dare say embarrassing errors, like the Caitlin Rosenthal inversion, some of the Ed Baptist statistical claims, I reached out to the paper first and was in conversation with them back and forth probably over the first 6 months of the project's existence. And each and every time they just blew me off and said, no, we don't need to do anything. And then they'd go slightly edit the text on the website, or like very behind the scenes types of attempting to correct errors without admitting that they are correcting errors, or attempting to really send them down the memory hole, make them go away, and let's focus on this new shiny object and pretend that doesn't disrupt our claims here.
What frightens me to have college-age kids that we're in a society now that this is my truth.
Yeah.
You have your truth, this is my truth.
Oh, exactly.
And this is what they're being taught.
Well, and it's back to the Pulitzer Prize being awarded to this thing. When it was first awarded, I thought, yeah, this is a controversial choice. It's not what I would have picked if I had been a judge. And I don't think any self-respecting judge should have picked it for all the defects and flaws in it. But the thing that turned that from a point of disagreement, and this is actual misconduct, was the discovery of the deleted passages that were done almost certainly to manipulate the Pulitzer Committee.
Are
Yeah.
you implying that the history taught in the United States of America since 1950 is accurate?
Not at all. Not at all. It's the way that K through 12 education is taught.
Talk about correcting the history,
Yeah.
so that our grandchildren will have an accurate picture of what has occurred in this country, and then we can correct it and move forward as one unit.
Absolutely. So I'm with you on that. This is why I contrast why I contrast something like the Disunion Project, which was just 7 or 8 years ago, with the 1619 Project. I think the New York Times Disunion series did it right.
Understood, but it was, I heard joking throughout, and
Yeah.
I'm a victim
Yeah.
of the education system.
Yeah.
I'm a student of history. I'm not a historian like yourself, but I have studied.
Yeah.
And I can point out thousands of flaws
Absolutely.
in textbooks that I taught from and was taught from
Absolutely.
over the years. Nobody's talked about correcting that.
Well-
So when this person comes out and says, look, there's flaws, here's what's happened, here's how we do it.
Yeah.
Now there's this, whoa, they shouldn't get a poster. Well, I've read a lot of books that shouldn't get a poster.
I agree with you that I'm fully in agreement that textbooks have been atrocious basically for as long as they existed.
Yes, they have.
They have been atrocious for as long as they existed.
The scholars haven't moved to correct it.
Well, the problem is the scholars' response, or at least what we're seeing right now in something like the 1619 Project, is to continue the same pattern of politicization, continue the same trajectory of error, just move it to a different side of the political spectrum.
Then let's form a team and put together a correct history.
Yeah.
And offer that to.
So this is one of the, and this was one of the faults, because the Trump administration tried to go do a counter 1619 thing, and it just went back to the old textbook. It's like,
The man is saying he only likes Eastern Europeans. Let's not get into that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about what's good for us.
Right,
As
right.
a whole, and not just one segment.
so I can give you a preview of a project that I'm working on right now that does attempt to do this.
That I'd like to.
Yeah, it goes back to our first contested presidential election, 1796. This is George Washington served his 2 terms. He was basically unanimously acclaimed as the winner of the Revolution. Second contest is between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, but there were 2 other competing candidates in the vice presidential role. Adams wins by 3 electoral votes. Jefferson defaults because the Electoral College at the time made him vice president. The problem that emerged in that election goes back to that character I mentioned, William Lawton Smith, or the pro-slavery Southerner at the Revolution. He penned a series of anonymous essays that were published throughout the country under a single pen, but with conflicting messages to try to exploit slavery as a dividing line that would allow his favored candidate, Thomas Pinckney, the governor of South Carolina, who had no chance of really winning on his own right, over Jefferson and Adams.
Pawn in the game.
Yeah, pawn in the game. So what does he do? In the northern papers, he publishes anonymous editorials that declare Thomas Jefferson is aiming to expand the empire of slavery. In the southern papers, he publishes editorials that point out Jefferson and originally included a clause in the Declaration of Independence condemning slavery, and points out correspondence Jefferson had with the Pennsylvania Quakers and the abolition societies, and points out philosophical musings where Jefferson announced that slavery was immoral. It was absolutely a forked tongue. That's the complexity of history of how this toxic, polluting issue and reality of our society intruded upon our political system at the earliest origins in the absolute worst ways. And it caused conflict because Jefferson reads these things and he doesn't know how to respond. If he says something in the North, it'll be now quoted in the South and vice versa. He's trying to win a national election and he's already in deep philosophical conflict over slavery, which he's a slave owner. It was also actually one of the first ones mentioned Sally Hemings for the first time in print ever, 1796. So it's deep in our political history. But then Alexander Hamilton, who wants the other guy to win, is reading this, and Hamilton was a member of an abolition society But he's like, if I speak out against what my fellow party member, William Watson Smith, is saying, we're going to lose the election. And that absolutely still happens today. That's the complexity of history, how it shows political motives get us off the rails of our philosophical ideals. So there is a real contest in history, and it goes back to some of those quotes about the Constitutional Convention. When Luther Martin is saying you cannot adopt this document as written because it doesn't take care of the slavery problem, he's absolutely right. But political necessity is what's trumping it. That's the story we should tell. Yeah.
The historical profession is such low-hanging fruit. I mean, if you read into the older works, you would know that 1619 was not the beginnings of slavery. It was the ship drops off some blacks in the colony of Virginia, and they have indentured servants. You read American Slavery, American Freedom, Evan Morgan, you would know that. They don't know the literature.
Right.
What's most bizarre, though, is that these cultural Marxists ignore the original Marxist scholarships, portraying slavery as a pre-capitalist institution.
That is also true. That is absolutely true.
I still can't figure out. I've never really bothered to read much of this.
I'm trying to figure out why Karl Marx has not been canceled if you read his writings on race relations.
How do they overcome that? They don't even know it.
Well, they don't know about it, or the ones that do, they brush it aside very intentionally.
You have to pretend to know a lot, not to know a lot of certain things.
It is. It's all selective. And this is why all these outrage campaigns, the cancellation campaigns. I am all in favor of talking about the problems in Jefferson, but tearing down a statue, that's just like symbolic iconoclasm. So that's the problem. That's the tearing down stuff is the history we need to get away from. What we need to focus on are details and nuance and talk about where the philosophical ideal is set and acclaim and celebrate that, but also look at what caused us to deviate from it.
And those old Marxist scholars would have a field day.
Oh, absolutely.
Gene did it basically too.
Exactly, and he used to point out that Fitzhugh was basically like a proto-Marxist.
Yeah, where are all these people that in the profession now that
They don't want to talk about
they
it.
don't want to do it because
Yeah.
you get canceled and you get
Yeah.
when that guy published that editorial, I said to my wife, I said, he's in trouble and he doesn't realize he's in trouble.
Yeah.
This is how bad it's become. Soon enough,
Oh, it is. Yeah,
24 hours later,
it's like painting a target. And if the president of the major association can be taken down, what does that mean for like the grad student that's just interested in doing good scholarship? Yeah, Richard.
Phil, good talk.
Thanks.
The Constitution itself has a provision getting rid of importation of slaves in 20 years. So that takes place automatically, kind of in 1808.
Yeah.
So one, does the project mention that? But then also, you mentioned Douglas, who was famous for saying, this is not a slave document, it's not a process. What I really want to ask is, there's that interesting period of about 6 years between the end of the war and the actual convention.
Yeah.
People forget that it was not obvious that there would be a constitution following the revolution. Wouldn't the project have been more plausible if what they said was 1776 was largely an anti-British thing? It wasn't necessarily going to lead to a constitution, but here's what's interesting. The anti-federalists who were against creating the constitution leaned toward being favorable to slavery.
Yeah.
And it was the Federalists who went the other way, right? And they're the ones who Hamilton menaced. They were pushing for a constitution. All I'm saying is, couldn't she have been more plausible by saying, it's the anti-federalists who I think were trying to dominate America and keep slavery, but then she'd have to confess that they failed.
They lost. She would have to admit.
Is that the problem?
Well, she'd have to admit that there is a pro-liberty story coming out of the revolution that in fact strikes some very significant early blows against slavery, some of the first in world history, and that's all the way from 1777 in Vermont forward. She doesn't want that story told. This became more and more evident. Frederick Douglass is an articulator of that story from our history. His famous Rochester speech, what's the meaning of July 4th? He says that he basically declares that the Constitution is a great and glorious pro-liberty document, and he does so in a very nuanced way. He goes back and says, notice that they never mention the word slave. And this is by design. You see it in Madison's notes. You see it in some of the other commentaries. They knew that this institution existed, and they didn't have the political majority to really do anything about it, although Luther Martin urged them to. But they also took the steps to make sure it was not enshrined And that's why you still have cases such as Dred Scott making it to the Supreme Court on the eve of the Civil War. Dred Scott would have been dead in the water had they written slavery into the document. In fact, you needed Roger B. Taney to go interpret it into law to do the exact opposite of Lord Mansfield in the Somerset case and write that it's implied that slavery is part of our Constitution, therefore black people are not citizens and not subject to its rights. That was a great reversal in a half century of jurisprudence in a contest, and this is why it's such a fight in the 1860 election is over Dred Scott. Yep.
So this is related to an earlier statement you made with regard to the academy in general.
Yep.
And considering the sterling success the Frankfurt School and its descendants
Yep.
has had on the university, what hopes do you have in that? Because it appears to me that those whose end results are essentially ideas have more power than those whose end results actually end in something. So
Yeah.
we don't refer to physicists or engineers as intellectuals.
Yeah.
Only sociologists, psychologists, and philosophers.
Yeah. Well, I give you a little bit of hope in the history profession, the history discipline. I refer to it as committing suicide right now. It has become so overly politicized, and I think there's some empirical evidence behind this. If you go back just the last decade, since 2011 to 2021, we've got stats now on college majors by discipline. History is actually in absolute decline. It's lost more majors as a percentage of what it had in 2011 than any other field. Students are running away from it. And I'm not saying the politics are the only thing, but this has definitely coincided as the field has swung to the far left. And the other thing that you see in there, when you do surveys of students, undergrads that are going in, they actually represent the full swath of American society. They're left, right, and everything in between. Libertarian, free market, communist, socialist, whatever. There's a very broad spread among the student body that's not reflected in the faculty, and history is one of the worst disciplines there. And yet this is occurring at a time when the concept of history has never been more popular. And I look at the market tests of history. People go on vacation to visit historical sites. They want to go see where Plymouth Rock is. They want to see Jamestown. They want to see all of the major battlefields of Normandy in France. They want to see medieval castles. Historical tourism has never been more popular, and yet people aren't majoring in it. Historical fiction is always at the top of the bestseller list. Popular writings with the David McCullough style, the non-academic versions, are always at the top of the bestseller list. People have a thirst for history, and that thirst is not being quenched in any way, any meaningful way by the academy. And I think people have figured that out, and that's why they're running away from the discipline. Does this mean that there's a market correction? Well, historians have buffered themselves somewhat because they make these awful classes they're teaching that use some of those same horrible textbooks from 50 years ago, or use the 1619 Project and haven't rectified or anything about it. They make them mandatory as part of the curriculum, so you have to take that to graduate. But you ask students, they say, well, that's the blow-off class. That's the one I don't care about. I don't study for the exam. I just phone it in, maybe even cheat off of my friend's notes and get the easy A, and don't really retain anything from it. So our educational system, I think, is really failing in historical knowledge. What it means, people are going elsewhere to find historical knowledge. Yep.
I heard the argument once that you cannot say any part of the modern economy is based on the antebellum period because the South was completely wiped out. I mean, there was literally nothing, there's almost nothing left, right, Phillip? Would their counter argument be that the North was strong because they exploited the South? Or is the argument I just said, is that a legitimate argument to say, how can it be built on nothing?
Well, they do claim that. I guess there's two things going on. First, the war itself. The war is a physical obliterator of capital stock.
Right.
It destroys industry, it destroys farms, it destroys physical property, levels entire cities.
Yeah, so how could that be the basis for subsequent
Yeah.
industrialization?
Right. So they say that there's a pre-war basis that comes out of cotton is sent to the textile mills of New England, and therefore, but it's a unilateral claim that the South is the main driver of the economy. What they are missing there is that no single product of production explanation of economic development has ever worked in history. They used to claim that the railroads are what industrialized the United States. Well, then Robert Fogel does some empirical analysis of it and finds out that it's actually railroads are a very close substitute to canal boats, which are a close substitute to the next means of transport. And what it implies is that suppose railroads had never been invented, they probably would not have ended up in much different of a place. They would have just used more boats instead of trains. These single product versions of history, they just don't stand up to empirical analysis. And it also omits, so this is one of the chapters I write in the book, quite a few of the Northerners that are involved in wealth creation and the early stages of industry and finance and Wall Street happen to become abolitionists in their own right. And they take conscious efforts, conscious steps to try to dissociate. I mean, it even goes as far as, let's say, divest themselves from the slave economy on moral grounds. I refer to one, tell the story of Arthur and Lewis Tappan, Tappan brothers, the owners of an early financial and mercantile house in New York City. Wall Street multimillionaires, would have been billionaires today. They were the main philanthropists that funded William Lloyd Garrison's publications. But because they became known as this, they were actually targeted, terroristically targeted by slave owners. There was a bounty placed on the Tappan brothers' heads that was plastered around the post offices in Charleston. It said $20,000, bring them dead or alive, and you'll get a reward. And of course, the local police are not willing to enforce murder on that. They actually wanted it. So the Tappan brothers had to go into hiding. Then they came up with another strategy. They tried to ruin them financially, where slave owners started to place orders from their dry goods exchange and then defraud them intentionally. So you place a massive order, send this to St. Louis, we'll have our agent come up from New Orleans to pick it up. Order arrives, and there's no recipient and no one paying the bills. So Lewis Tappan comes up with a really interesting idea to get around this. He says, this is going to ruin us because we're being targeted economically. And the government's not enforcing contracts there. None of the courts in the South will enforce these defrauded contracts. So we're going to create a private financial regulatory agency and sell subscriptions to abolition and anti-slavery aligned businesses. And what we do is we hire an agent to go to each of the major commercial cities, and that agent can approve the credit rating of any order that's placed with us, wire it back to New York City, and we'll decide to go through or not based on what that order is. It's the first credit agency in the United States, and all derivative ones that we have today were founded in 1842 by the Tappan brothers as a way to subvert the pro-slavery attacks on their business model. That's American capitalism.
That's a great way to end it, too. I can't thank you enough, Phil, for your scholarly work and also for your courage in taking on this issue. I'd like to thank you also very much for showing up and having our back, right? Because when you show up, it validates what we're about, and that is to basically promote free markets, entrepreneurship, capitalism. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And tell your friends. I want to call out George Leaf. He was helpful this week in basically reaching out and letting people know. So it just takes a couple of emails and maybe a couple of phone calls. And when you're at a party or with friends, just let them know that we exist. Thank you very much.